Welcome to Module 9, the penultimate module of this course. This module is on the question of integration, and in particular we'll be looking at European integration and how it works out, or how it has traditionally worked out, and some of the challenges facing it today. To understand European integration, we must look at the question of Cold War. That without understanding Cold War, we cannot really understand what European integration is today and how it came to be the way it is today. The backdrop of European integration is formed by the Cold War, and the backdrop of Cold War is formed by the two world wars that define the first half of the 20th century. And in particular, what we must pay attention is the question of the nuclear threat, the dawn of the nuclear age, the invention of the nuclear bomb, and the sort of weapons race that happens in the sort of right following the Second World War between the United States and the Soviet Union over developing nuclear weapons. So at the end of the Second World War, the United States already had its nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union was developing its own nuclear program. So the cost of war in Europe became too high. So it was a war-torn continent that no longer wanted to risk a third world war, a third continent-wide war. Another issue to sort of pay attention in relation to the European integration is the question of famine. Following the Second World War, what we have is a continent-wide famine. That most of the farmland is destroyed. Most of the able-bodied people have either been killed or injured in the war or have sought refuge elsewhere. And more importantly, there's also the question of a destroyed infrastructure. Most European cities were destroyed following the Second World War. If we look at this map on the slide, what you see is the way in which famine is spread around Europe. What you see is a great deal of malnutrition and a great deal of problems over food supply. So countries like Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and to a certain extent Germany were in full famine conditions. But in other countries, for the most part, there has been a degree of food shortage. Following the end of the Second World War, the Americans were presented with a choice of whether to sort of remain involved in Europe or to sort of pull back and consider their options. So the United States decided to sort of focus on staying in Europe with the implicit goal of keeping Russians out of Western Europe, keeping Germans down, and keeping the United States in. And they had two sort of avenues to do this. The first one was the question of Marshall Plan, which was an economic plan that was geared towards redeveloping Europe and making it a capitalist liberal economy. And the second one was the presence of American troops to counter a Soviet threat. And in that regard, the presence of American nuclear weapons in Europe also facilitated a deterrence. We must understand that Europe looked profoundly different following the end of the Second World War than it does today. Most of Germany, for example, was destroyed through American air raids. If you look at the slide, you'll see that sort of the city of Cologne, which is a major city in Germany today, was basically unrecognizable with the exception of the main cathedral, which sort of remained. The American military involvement and the economic involvement was particularly clear in places like Berlin, where if you look at the slide, what you see is what's called the Checkpoint Charlie, which was an American control point. Berlin was an interesting case because it was surrounded by the Soviet Union, in particular the sort of German Soviet Republic, but it was kept alive through an American airlift, which was both economic and military aid that came into the region. We must first look at the question of the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was a multi-country, multi-billion-dollar financial effort to revitalize European economy. It was geared towards redeveloping the infrastructure, kickstarting the economies. It was a major foreign aid project for Europe. The secondary component of that American involvement was military involvement. As part of a grand strategy, the United States opened up a number of military bases, or maintained a number of military bases in Europe with troop levels at hundreds of thousands to sort of deter Russian intervention. In some of those bases, the United States also kept nuclear weapons. The backdrop to this issue is also the question of Germany. What happens with Germany? This in the literature is referred to as the German question, but what happens to Germany after the Second World War? So if you look at the slide, you see sort of current-day Germany being split into two, Western Germany and Eastern Germany. Western Germany was a liberal democratic republic, whereas Eastern Germany was a Soviet communist republic. And if you look at it, the sort of the yellowish green part of the inside the Eastern Germany is Berlin, which was split between the Allied powers and areas of control. And following the fall of the Iron Curtain, the Western Berlin was effectively blockaded by the Soviet Union. The German question manifested perhaps a larger question or anxiety about the future of Europe. So I call this the Germany at crossroads. What happened in Germany was going to be indicative of what was going to happen in Europe. So the options were the question of communism, so the whole of Germany could have become communist, an undesirable outcome. Similarly undesirable was the rise or the return of nationalism. The third outcome, which was the eventual outcome, was the question of unification, so how to bring two Germanys together. And a fourth, an unlikely outcome at first, but perhaps the outcome that determined the unification, was the question of Europeanization, the sort of like integration of Germany to the rest of Europe, and in particular to France, to avoid another world war. So here, let's take a moment to think about what Europe is and what Europe does. In particular, in this module, we're looking at Europe as a polity, as a political entity, with a separate function outside of the nation state, but as a complementary function. What we see in Europe is called integration, and Carnson makes authors of a book on international organizations refer to regional integration as states within a geographic area can more easily and effectively address economic and security problems because they are closer to the problems and are presumed to share some background and approaches. And this is what we see in Europe. The fact that Europe is a geographical entity, a geographical area, means that European problems can have European solutions. So it's easier to find solutions to those problems inside of Europe than perhaps inside the individual states that form Europe or inside a larger polity like the globe. In Europe, what we have today is an organization called the European Union. It is an international organization, but it's actually primarily a regional organization. It consists of 28 European states, and it has economic, political, and security implications to the European continent, and we will talk about that in detail. If you look at this map, what you see is the European Union today. Countries in yellow are the countries who are candidate countries that have applied to join the European Union, that are going through the processes of joining the European Union. And you'll see that Britain is in red because Britain is currently a member of the European Union, but as a result of the Brexit vote, they have voted to leave the European Union. So currently they're negotiating what that departure is going to look like. European Union is not a state, but it is the second largest polity in the world. It consists of 28 states. It has 24 official languages. Approximately, it has 510 million citizens that fall within the European Union jurisdiction, and its GDP per capita is close to $35,000, and it is, as a result, an influential global actor. The evolution of the European Union is a result of a set of treaties. So the origins of the organization goes back to the Treaty of Paris and the Twin Treaties of Rome, both signed in 52 and 58 respectively. Then in 1967, you have what's called the Merger Treaty that creates the European communities, and in 92, European communities became, as a result of the Maastricht Treaty, the European Union. In 2009, the European Union developed a new constitution as part of the Lisbon Treaty, and currently it has 28 member states, the latest member being Croatia. In the past 5 or 6 decades, the European Union successfully established a common market, a single currency, a common security and defense policy, a common external border and visa regime, and a common sets of institutions and bureaucracies. These institutions enable what's called the four freedoms, and this is the freedom of capital, goods, persons, and services within the European Union. That means that in Europe, a European Union citizen can live in any of these 28 countries, and the currency can move, as well as services and goods can move in terms of trading those services or goods freely without any restrictions, without any sort of tariffs or trade barriers. So meaning that the European Union as a space has become an opened up space for European citizens to live anywhere in Europe. Most of the scholarship on European Union looks at different crises. So the defining crises of the European Union in the 90s was this particular tension among the member states that was to decide whether the European integration should be deepened, so more integration, or widened, including more countries. And what we saw in the 90s was with the fall of the Soviet Union was a new set of countries became eligible to apply for the membership of the European Union. In particular, these countries were in the Central and Eastern European countries and countries in the Balkans. And at the same time, the European Union went through sort of further integration and introduced a single currency called the euro and has developed the Schengen Treaty, which meant that the European citizens could live anywhere in Europe, and the external borders of the European Union would be collectively protected by European countries. The deepening and widening crisis brought forward some set of questions of what Europe is, where it is, and when it is. So where Europe is a question of membership. So can any country join the European Union? Where are the natural limits of that? And in that regard, the question has become about the Turkish membership. Is Turkey a European country? Can it join the European Union? Similarly, in terms of the politics of it, what do the founding members of the European Union envision the European Union to be? How much integration is acceptable? How much of it is not? And then the question of modernity comes in as to, once again, in relation to others, as to whether they're developed enough, they're modern enough to become European Union members. So those three questions became inspiring or influential questions on determining European Union as a whole. Today we see a new set of crises that is going through Europe. In sort of since the beginning of 2000s, we've seen the crisis of terrorism, attacks in Madrid, London, and Paris, etc., have meant that the European Union became more security conscious. Similarly, financial crises in Spain, Greece, Ireland, Italy have meant that the European Union had to sort of rethink its financial viability. And then finally, or sort of simultaneously, the question of refugee crisis that affected primarily countries like Spain, Greece, Italy, and to a certain extent Malta, have meant that the coherence of the external border controls have become challenged. And all of these crises have led to a more profound crisis in Europe, which is the populist nationalism. So we've seen this with the Brexit referendum, but also sort of the rise of right-wing nationalist movements across Europe in countries like Germany, Italy, Greece, and UK, France. Yeah, this has become another challenge to viability of European integration. So I've been using this word integration for a while, and let's take a moment to think about what integration is. Integration refers to a policy process that focuses on the unification of policies and different policy practices among states. This happens in two possible ways, three possible ways. The question of regulations, so creating new laws, new rules, deregulation, which is elimination of rules and regulations, and finally harmonization, which is to take multiple different kinds of codes or laws and to find a common set, a harmonized set of laws that then function as integrated laws. With the European integration, what we see is a historical process of policy cooperation, so policy regulation, deregulation, or policy harmonization that result in the creation of the European Union as we know it today. So things like the common market, the euro as a single currency, creation of the Schengen area of free movement, and the common agricultural policy are all results of a kind of regional integration that focuses on either regulation, deregulation, or policy harmonization. So if you look at this map, what you see is the map of the Schengen area of free movement. So in this map, what is impressive is that technically speaking, you can go from Lithuania to Portugal without crossing a single border, which, if you know the history of Europe, it's an impressive achievement given that sort of most of the 20th century, the half of 20th century, national borders and especially the Iron Curtain between East and West meant that Europeans could not travel freely in their continent. Similarly, if you look at this map, what you see is the countries that have or are in the process of implementing euro as their single currency. The countries in blue all use euro as their currency. So, meaning that if you get paid your salary in Cyprus, which is the tiny island on the bottom right corner of the map, you will be able to use your same currency without any currency exchanges, without any difference in value in Germany, France, Portugal, or Spain, or Ireland if you were on vacation in any of those countries. What motivates integration? Is it economic interest? Of course, there's a component of economics. Integration means that trade can be done easily. Political interests, there is a tendency to scale integration in a way that means that countries are more peaceful among themselves. Social interest, yes, there is that element. And security interest, sometimes, as we've seen in the discussion of NATO, there is an interest in collectivizing or creating a community for security. Another question that comes in relation to discussions of integration is who drives integration? Is it the states? Is it the European Union institutions? Is it citizens? Is it regions within the European Union? The reality is that the integration has thus far mostly been driven by states and EU institutions. But what we're seeing is citizens and regions are increasingly becoming active in taking control or steering integration in different directions. To appreciate the scope of the European Union today, we should look at the EU institutions and what those institutions are and what they do. European Commission is the executive body of the European Union. It represents quote-unquote European interests, sort of integrated interests. It consists of 27 commissioners, each with their specific or special portfolio, like ministers in a government. It has 33 directorate generals that look at different policy portfolios. And the Commission, just like a council of ministers, initiates the EU-level policymaking. So it pushes sort of a particular agenda on things that the Commission sees as fitting or necessary for furthering European integration. European Council consists of heads of states of the European member states. It represents state interests, it defines the general political directions and priorities of the European Union, and it is responsible for the future directions of integration. In this body, decisions are made by qualified majority voting, which means that each country gets a vote number in proportion to their population. So bigger countries have more votes than smaller countries, so that there is a sort of representation of the population. And it pursues co-decision with the Parliament, which I'll explain in a second what that means. European Parliament is a unique body because it is the only directly elected body of the European Union. It means that it runs its own elections and the European citizens vote to elect their own members of European Parliament alongside their own members of Parliament. It has a legislative function, and it has two important functions every so often, which is it approves the members of the Commission, so it improves the College of Commissioners, and it approves the EU budget, which is an annual budget. Members of the European Parliament sit along broadly defined parties, but they don't run on party platforms. So there are no European parties, but like-minded parties of right and left and etc. Greens sit together. And this co-decision process with the Council means that the European Parliament passes policy proposals presented by the Commission back and forth with the Council. So the heads of state and the Parliament sort of have a back and forth process that goes over the proposed policies that are presented by the European Council. Council of the European Union is also known as the Council or the Council of Ministers, is the platform for meetings between national ministers on different portfolios. So that body looks after national interests in everyday EU policies. And it once again is decisions are made by qualified majority voting, which once again refers to each country being given a number of votes based on their population. European Court of Justice is the European Union's internal court. It is the highest court in matters related to European integration. So its purpose is that the laws are, it ensures that the law is observed in the interpretation and application of treaties. So it oversees conflicts that arise as a result of European integration. One thing that we see looking at all of these institutions is that the European Union has a democratic deficit, that the European Union decisions are removed from its citizens because the only elected body is the parliament, which is within the general ecosystem of European Union institutions. It's a relatively weak body where there is very little room for democratic representation. If you are asked the question, so what does the European Union do? What you will see, the answer would be that the European Union fosters cooperation and integration among EU member states, and its focus primarily is to smooth the operation of those common spaces, the four freedoms that we've talked about. So things like the market, currency, and borders. And it does so through harmonization or regulation or deregulation of policies. Now, let's take a moment to think about or sort of go over some of the examples of what the European Union does. One example would be the Common Agricultural Policy. This policy was created at the end of the Second World War as a response to the famine, so that to avoid another famine in Europe. So the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP as people refer to it, ensure a fair standard of living for farmers and provides a stable and safe food supply, affordable prices for consumers. So its focus is to create viable food production and sustainable management of natural resources, and it pursues a balanced development of rural areas throughout the EU. Another example of European Union in action is the idea or the sort of the concept of protected geographical indication. So this is a European designation that is there to protect regional foods, and it protects regional products that have a specific quality, reputation, or other characteristics attributable to that area. So, for example, we can't call any sparkling wine champagne. It has to be produced in the Champagne region of France. Or Gorgonzola or Camembert cheeses cannot be called that if they're not produced in those particular regions. So what you see is that particular sort of standardization, that particular regulation has a role in ensuring quality and standards in European markets, and the European Union is actively involved in creating those designations. We can look at the European Union in multiple ways. We can look at it itself as an international phenomenon. We can look at it as it sort of being a product of a bunch of European countries coming together to work. But at the same time, the European Union itself, the institutions outside of its member states, represents a global actor, that the European Union is a global actor. The European Union has its own foreign service. It's called the European External Action Service. It's based out of Brussels. The EU has permanent missions around the world, so it has its own embassies. EU has an observer seat in the UN, in the G8, or now called the G7, WTO in the Middle East Quartet, and the de facto has 2 veto votes in the UN Security Council, precisely because both France and Great Britain are members of the European Union. Now, obviously, with Brexit, it's going to probably soon have only one country in the UN Security Council, with Britain leaving. It also negates free trade agreements. Canada and the United States, or the Canada and the European Union, has recently signed a free trade agreement. And at the time of the recording of these slides in July 2018, what we see is also that the European Union just signed another free trade agreement with Japan. And sort of prior to the election of Donald Trump, EU and US were in the process of negotiating a free trade deal, though I don't really know if that's going to go forward. The European Union also functions as a regional soft power of prestige and reputation, and a sort of as an actor with certain credentials like democracy and capitalism and free market, that it signals particular virtues to other neighboring countries. The soft power of the European Union becomes particularly clear in relation to countries that want to join the European Union. So towards the countries that want to join the European Union, European Union maintains a particular level of power. And membership to the European Union is defined by what's called the Copenhagen criteria, named after the Danish capital. And the process of membership to the European Union, if we look at, for example, how the latest member of the European Union joined, the Croatia, you'll meet the Copenhagen criteria, then you'll develop an association agreement. Then the process will follow what's called the negotiations of the acquis communautaire, which is the European Union body of laws. We'll talk about that in a second. Then there'll be a referenda in the country that is joining the European Union, as well as any other country that is currently a member of the European Union that wants to hold the referendum on that participation of that country. And then the country will, if everything goes according to plan, then the country will join as a member of the European Union. So the latest country to do so has been Croatia. So historically, the European Union used enlargement or integration as its foreign policy tool. It's provided the prospect of membership to countries that it wanted to reform or that it wanted to sort of engage with. Enlargement refers to the inclusion of non-European member states into the European Union. It requires the implementation of European Union law, or the EU acquis. As I said, Croatia is the most recent member, but currently Turkey, Iceland, Macedonia, Serbia, and Montenegro are all candidate countries that are going through their own negotiation process. And this process is obviously a taxing process for both parties. So if we look at the map, we see that they're the dark blue countries. Those are the countries that are currently members of the European Union. The light blue countries are candidate countries, and yellow and green countries are countries that are either going through the process or will start sort of applying for the process of membership eventually. What you see in this map is a notable exception of Norway and Switzerland, who have incorporated the European Union laws, but have refused to join the European Union to maintain their national sovereignty. And eventually, we will see the Great Britain being the first country to leave the European Union in a year's time, too. Acquis communautaire refers to the accumulated legislation of the legal acts and court decisions that constitute the body of the European Union law. So during the process of enlargement, the European Union acquis is divided into a number of chapters for the easier absorption or negotiation by candidate countries. In the latest round of negotiations with Croatia, the acquis was divided into 35 different chapters. And these chapters range from issues related to free movement of goods, to consumer and health protection, to transport policy, to financial control. So it's a diverse number of laws, but all of these laws need to be incorporated into the national legislation of the candidate country for them to be able to join the European Union. And it is a taxing process, both in terms of the sort of number of things that needs to be covered, but it's also a very long process. So if you look at how Estonia became an EU member, what you see is in 1991, they get their independence from the Soviet Union, and they join sort of they develop an association agreement in 1995, and it takes them almost a decade of negotiations with the European Union to come to a point where they become members, and then takes another sort of 10 years for them to join the Euro zone, which means that they can have the Euro as their own currency. Decades of enlargement resulted in a fatigue of the European Union. So the European public has become tired of absorbing new countries and paying for that process, and basically signing off on the risks of having these new countries join the European Union. In light of the refugee crisis, in light of the financial crisis of the sort of the second decade of the 21st century, so it's 2010 onwards, what you see is a sort of a popular backlash against the idea of enlargement. And then this popular backlash is particularly embodied around the discussions of Turkey joining the European Union. And if you look at this chart, you'll understand why that is the case. So if you look at it, the richest country in the European Union per capita is Luxembourg. So it has a GDP per capita over $80,000 per person. But it also is the country with possibly some of the lowest populations in the European Union. If you look at Turkey, you see a country that is barely around $10,000 per capita, but also has a population of close to sort of 80 million. So absorbing one country versus another presents its own set of challenges. So to counter this, the European Union proposed an alternative to engage with countries that are near the European Union but will not become members of the European Union. This was called neighborhood policy, and it was presented as a post-enlargement policy tool. So it was seen as a way to stabilize these neighboring countries to the east and south, so in Caucasus and Central Asia, and also the Middle East and the North African regions, where the idea would be that these countries would share everything with the European Union, but the institutions will function as a ring of friends. If you look at this map, you see how that sort of ring of friends functions. You see sort of countries like the Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Syria, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. And if you look at these countries, what you see is that these countries are in huge conflicts. So Ukraine is in a civil war. Similarly, sort of there's a civil war in Syria. Israel and Palestine have its own issues. Egypt has had military coups. Libya is in civil war. So you clearly see that the European neighborhood policy formula did not work as effectively as perhaps European policy leaders hoped it would. So whereas integration or enlargement presented one challenge to the European Union, another challenge was the Eurozone crisis. So what happened was the euro as a currency relied on monetary integration. So the central banks of the countries that use euro sort of collectivized their potential or their sort of functions and created a European central bank. But monetary integration happened without fiscal integration, meaning that the countries maintained their own budgets but gave up the control over their currency to a central European central bank. This combined with chronic budget deficits in Greece, Italy, and Portugal, as well as sort of perhaps collapses of the real estate market in Ireland and Spain, undermine the overall stability of the Eurozone, meaning that sort of wealthier and more stable countries became sort of more risk prone as a result of the process. So the European institutions had to develop solutions to this problem. To understand what this crisis meant or how it sort of unfolded, Greek government debt crisis is a perfect case study to sort of engage with this idea of the European financial crisis. So the Greek financial crisis, or the Greek sovereign debt crisis, started in around 2009, and it has been the first of 4 sovereign debt crises inside the Eurozone. The countries that followed Greece were Italy, Ireland, and Spain. And it is considered to be the part of the Great Recession around the world. So it is somehow or sort of generally associated with the fall or the failure of the mortgage market in the United States too. And the root cause of this crisis was a combination of structural weaknesses in the Greek economy, along with a decade-long pre-existence of overly high structural deficits and debt to GDP levels of public accounts. So the Greek state got into more debt than it can pay. And it did so in a long period of time over many consecutive years. So it ran a budget deficit year after year for more than multiple decades. the actors involved in this are the Hellenic Republic, so the Republic of Greece, the European Central Bank, European Commission, for the most part also sort of pushed by Germany, the International Monetary Fund, credit agencies, foreign banks, and hedge funds, as well as sort of, obviously the Greek citizens. So as part of the crisis, the Greek government was forced to take pretty huge rescue loans from international organizations like the European Central Bank, as well as the IMF and World Bank. But IMF and World Bank, or the ECB loans, come with conditions and conditionalities. And in particular, what we saw was a process called austerity, which is a combination of massive job cuts in the public sector, benefits being slashed, pensions eliminated, services reduced or eliminated. So it had a very real effect on everyday life of Greek citizens. The GDP of the country suffered its worst decline in 2011, when it clocked a growth, or sort of a decline, of almost 7%. So the economy shrunk by 7%. In that year alone, close to 110,000 Greek corporations or Greek private companies went bankrupt, and the unemployment reached a high of 23% overall, and the youth unemployment, so people of like 18 and 25 or 18 and 30, reached 55%. Now, you might ask yourself, so how does this impact the rest of Europe? Greek economy only represents 2.5% of the Eurozone community. But because European Union has a single currency, the euro, and the euro is not just Greek, but rather sort of for all of those countries that are members of the Eurozone, if Greece had defaulted on its loans, it would have a devaluation for all of the Eurozone. So meaning that all of the European countries would lose the value of their currency. So in 2010, the danger was that a default by the Greek government may cause investors to lose faith in other Eurozone countries. So countries like Germany would be affected. In 2012, the contagion risk for other Eurozone countries in the event of an uncontrolled Greek default has greatly diminished. And since 2013, the contagion risk for the other Eurozone countries in the event of an uncontrolled Greek default further abated to an insignificant level. But in 2010, there was a moment where that particular risk meant that all of the European Union countries that use the euro were on high alert. And this chart is quite revealing because it just shows the sort of like pulse of the Greek economy and how crisis provoked this huge decline in GDP, but also sort of had an effect on perhaps reducing to a certain extent the public debt and the public debt to GDP ratio. So as the GDP dropped, the debt also dropped, but then Greek economy is still far from being in a place to be called healthy. So in 2014, the idea of Brexit was being thrown around. The idea was that if the Greek government was going to default on its debts, then perhaps it should leave the European Eurozone, or should be kicked out of the Eurozone. So Greek government owes to the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, as well as other private lenders. And as of early 2014, there was a period where they defaulted on their debt to the IMF. And the ECP sort of approved or sort of acted as a guarantor on the debt until the Greek government had a referendum. So the Greek government forced itself to have a referendum. And depending on the outcome of the referendum, Greece was in a position where they could have been forced to leave the Eurozone. So had the Greek government gone on with not paying their debt, the ECP would have lifted their guarantee on the Greek sovereign debt, and the international credit agencies would have reduced the Greek credit grade to basically junk, meaning that it would have been very difficult or very expensive for the Greek government to get any debt. Greece would have had to leave the Eurozone and forced to issue their own currency again. Their currency prior to being euro was drachma. And then they would have also had very serious financial trouble in the short to medium term, meaning that they would have been unable to pay civil servants and also for all the kinds of other different services. So basically, in effect, Greece would have gone bankrupt. Now, obviously, that did not happen, so Greece is still part of the Eurozone, and we are in a position where the European Union is facing some challenges. But to understand what European Union does, let's take a moment to think about the take-home points for this lecture. So, World War II and its traumas influence European leaders to rethink their future political priorities. American aid combined with Russian threat forced integration as an attractive avenue. EU obviously remains an exception to the norm of traditional IR theories, that there is no other regional organization like the European Union. It is somewhere between a state and an international organization. It is an instance of a community. And this week's question touches on, or this module's question touches on that question of how specific or how unique is the European integration. So the question for Module 9 is, does the European model of integration provide a roadmap for integration among states around the world? If so, why? If not, why not? Thank you very much.